Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending where you are. Welcome to the webinar within the London Climate Action Week, which is called Avoiding a Zombie Recovery, Public Money for Clean Energy, not for Fossil Fuels. And we are going to have an interactive discussion. People are still joining. So thank you very much who has joined already. The webinar is brought to you by the Energy Policy Tracker team, which includes several organizations behind it. In the core group, we have 6 think tanks, and their logos are on the screen right now. It's the International Institute for Sustainable Development, Stockholm Environment Institute, Center on Global Energy Policy of the Columbia University, Overseas Development Institute, Oil Change International, Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. The latter one, unfortunately, is not tuning in right now because they are in Japan. It's too late for Japan. But other than that, I know that a lot of people from the team have joined. And also there are almost 20 other organizations who are working with us from different countries, mostly G20, but also outside of the G20. I can see that, again, some people have joined. So we're going to have a discussion with space for different people from different locations to contribute. Our panelists are an exciting crew. Joining from 4 continents. I'll introduce them quickly, but first maybe I'll introduce myself. So my name is Iveta Gerasimchuk. I'm lead for sustainable energy supplies with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And I'd like to share for housekeeping just a few items. First, this webinar is being recorded. We're going to publish it later on, and also you can see that there is a chat box here where you can reach both panelists and attendees. But if you're going to ask a question, we would like you to use the Q&A box and specify who on the panel you are directing the question to. And we will also try to make it really interactive and redirect it to somebody else if we know that somebody else can also chip in on the question. So with that, I think we can go to the introduction of the panel. And then I'll just say a couple of words about the idea behind this webinar and what we are going to discuss. So we have 6 distinguished panelists from different backgrounds. First of all, I'd like to introduce Matthias Frumeri, who is Director and Head of Delegation to UNFCCC at the Ministry of Environment of Sweden. So Matthias is joining us from Stockholm. We also have Tom Mørenhood from the Columbia University, and in particular, Center on Global Energy Policy, where Tom is a professor and also a resident scholar. We have Anna Geddes, associate with the energy program at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, joining from Amsterdam. We are also lucky to have Kanika Chabla, who is director at the Center for Energy Finance at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, joining from New Delhi. We're lucky because Kanika is joining very late her time, so thank you very much for this. Then on the other side of the time zones, so we have Elisa Arond from the Stockholm Environment Institute in Latin America. Elisa is a research fellow joining us from her duty station in Bogota, Colombia. And last but not least, we have Laurie van der Burg, who is senior campaigner at Oil Change International, joining from Amsterdam. And I'd like also to say big thanks to our brilliant interns, Max Schmidt and Silke Boats, who are working behind the scenes and who have really helped to put this webinar together. So a few years ago at ISD, we published a paper which was called Zombie Energy, Climate Benefits of Ending Fossil Fuel Subsidies. And we use the term zombie energy, not just because we were in the Halloween mood, but also because we felt that a lot, and our research proved that a lot of fossil fuel projects are not viable without government support. And by providing subsidies and other forms of support to fossil fuel energy, governments, unfortunately, are resurrecting these zombies that would not be viable because of competition with renewable energy or because of competition with each other. So we were hoping that in the current crisis situation, some of these unviable projects can go to the past for good. But again, unfortunately, what we see and what our research shows is that, again, government support rescues some of these projects. And of course, it's a difficult time for all businesses, for all sectors. But we have scarce public resources, and we really would like to discuss at this event on how we can best use scarce public resources for making something out of this crisis which will pave the way for a safer climate, which will not lock in fossil fuel projects and business as usual, but would rather propel some of the clean energy innovations and other progressive policies for a better future. So, as I said, we are a group of organizations who have been working together for a while already and being joined by new partners. It's better that everyone introduces their work on their own. So I'd like to ask the panelists to be really quick and limit their remarks to 5 or maximum 7 minutes. The way it's going to work, we are going to start with some opening remarks by Matthias Frumery, and then we will go straight into questions where some of the panelists will be the leads, but others will support them. And further, we will also open the floor for the questions from the audience, and we count on your questions, so please prepare them. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to Matthias at the moment. As I said, Matthias is director and head of delegation to UNFCCC at the Ministry of Environment of Sweden, and he's also representing Sweden on the group of countries called Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform. Matthias, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Iveta, and thanks so much for inviting me to say a few words as opening remarks in this seminar. It's really a highly relevant topic, and greetings from Stockholm to you all. Firstly, just to say that how quickly it was so encouraging to see how quickly the concept of green recovery was established during the spring. Some of you might recall the UN Secretary General and his commitment in March to support UN member states, and I quote, to ensure that the global economy and the people we serve emerge stronger from the crisis. And he also said that we have a framework for action, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement. So from our side, sort of on the basis of that, we set out to provide some thoughts on what we would think a green recovery could look like. And of course, we could build on the Swedish climate policy framework, which was established already in 2017. And as some of you might know from the Swedish side, we aim to be climate neutral by 2045. So in April, we had developed a set of policy areas which we thought could be useful in the establishment of a green recovery from the COVID crisis. And just allow me to highlight a couple of those points here. One would be avoiding subsidies that rebuild or increase socioeconomically inefficient and heavily polluting industries. Another would be use economic incentives such as taxes on heavily polluting activities. We've had a carbon tax in Sweden since 1991. Third point would be ensure resilience and low carbon pathways in investments in infrastructure such as transport, IT, and cities. A fourth element could be promoting sustainable finance in order to give investors the incentive and opportunity to finance environmentally sustainable projects or assets. Another principle would be developing and promoting green bonds, and also using well-defined and uniform and clear sustainability criteria in public procurement, as well as supporting the industrial transition towards carbon neutrality, for example, through industry-owned roadmaps toward carbon neutrality, as showcased by Fossil-Free Sweden, which the Swedish government set up a couple of years ago, which we also see as a good opportunity or a good example of cooperation between government and business in the road towards carbon neutrality. And another example of that is also the leadership group for industry transition, which Sweden and India launched at the Climate Action Summit in September last year. Another element could be trade policies as an instrument for achieving the targets of the Paris Agreement by promoting the dissemination of emission reduction technologies and services. We believe that trade barriers and tariffs, on climate-friendly goods, services, and environmental technology should be eliminated. And finally, modernization of the international regulatory framework for export credits and other public trade financing should include an ambitious policy to tackle climate change. So those were sort of a couple of the areas which we found to be useful when promoting a green recovery. And we've seen, I guess all of us, a number of statements and events on green recovery during the past couple of months. And as you probably all know, the IMF estimates show that some $12,000 billion in fiscal measures have been launched since the start of the crisis to overcome the economic crisis. And at the same time, we're seeing in the invitation to your webinar today that your research suggests that some 54% of the money that G20 and other 7 other countries have allocated goes directly to economic sectors responsible for production and consumption of fossil fuels. And this obviously goes in the wrong direction. So I'm glad to also see that you're suggesting that it's not too late to tip the balance toward a green recovery. And we strongly believe that we must embrace this opportunity to make the best use of these massive investments that we're now seeing to accelerate the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. And we really believe that we have an opportunity to come out of the COVID crisis stronger and more ready to tackle the climate crisis than we were going into the COVID crisis. And just to highlight maybe a couple of issues which Sweden has done, the government presented what was billed as sort of the greenest budget in history in September. So that's our budget for next year, 2021. It included measures amounting to some 9.7 billion Swedish krona in green recovery measures for industry transition, nature-based solutions, transport, energy efficiency, local action, as well as also up to 25 billion Swedish krona in green guarantees for the coming 3 years. Maybe just sort of also to wrap up a bit, a couple of principles which we believe could help us keep us on the path to climate neutrality. And one of those would be in these recovery packages or recovery measures, we need to be aware of the balance of focusing on financial survival here and now for individual companies, but also with sort of holding back on long-term sustainability action. And at the same time, also, it's an opportunity to ensure the integration of climate action in national budget and planning processes. And this, of course, goes for also, in sort of normal times, that this should be almost like a prerequisite for ensuring climate action, that we make sure that it's integrated in our national budget and planning processes. One of those principles could be that broad-based recovery strategies need to promote employment and competitiveness, as well as embracing the opportunity for structural reform in the economy when we're doing these kind of mass investments. And finally, just to also highlight that economic recovery measures that are not explicitly linked to the green transition should not, on the other hand, counteract the climate neutrality objective. So even if you're not focusing also on green measures per se, you should at least make sure that your actions do not sort of run against your path to climate neutrality. Let me also just say that we have, especially being sort of part of the Climate Action Week, that we have high expectations on the incoming UK and Italian presidency of the G7 and the G20 for next year. And of course, we will do our utmost to support from our side, and we hope to build and continue building a strong global alliance to ensuring a green recovery. And just finally, I mean, I would say that we would know what to do, the kind of actions we need to take. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on how we go from words to action. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matthias. So let's go from words to examples of action. I'm going to hand over the floor straight to Tom Murrenhood, who is joining us from the Columbia University in New York. So please share your screen, Tom, if you're going to use any visual material.
Yep, indeed. Thank you, Iveta. Let me start there. Everybody can see that? Perfect. All right. I was asked to stick to 5 minutes, and I really like this concept, so I'm going to try to do exactly that. I basically have 3 points to make, three very short points. The first one was on the energy policy tracker, but I think Yvette has mentioned that very well. You know, the collective of organizations that does bottom-up tracking, so we really look at specific energy-related measures. You can find it on energypolicytracker.org. And I just quickly also wanted to highlight one thing that might be useful for people in this call. We just added recently, 2 weeks ago, a search database where you can look at countries, particular categories, energy types, sectors, and so forth, and can see what type of policies have been enacted since COVID-19 or since the beginning of the year in any case. And you can also have a look at that, have a look at the value committed to such policies. So that's number one, which is basically on the tool. Now, number two, what does the tool tell us? The tool tells us that so far there's definitely not a green recovery, right? And it's even a little bit reminiscent of 2008, where we definitely had a non-green recovery to the global financial crisis. Here you can quickly see sort of the balance. So this is G20 plus, right? So this is not just the G20, these are all the countries that the Energy Policy Tracker team currently is tracking. So we're close to about $500 billion in energy-related funding pledges. More than half of that, as Matthias was also saying, is going to fossil energy right now, right? So it's about 54%. 3 quick points on that I wrote here as well. Number one is there are a lot of bailouts in mobility, and part of that is to harness competitiveness and to make sure that, you know, unemployment does not skyrocket even more as it already has, right? So these are obviously very you know, fair social goals. The big problem with some of those bailouts, with some of this fossil category here, is that it comes without any conditions attached. And without any conditions, I mean specifically environmental conditions, right? So if we take, for example, bailouts to automobile sectors, if those automobile sectors do not have any incentives to increase fuel efficiency or to move towards electrification of transport, both of those are sort of on a clear trajectory anyway. That's kind of money wasted, right? Second one, very important. This is an interesting graph that looks at 500 billion, but many more policies have been enacted which actually do not have a monetary estimate next to them, right? But which do impact production. A reduction of environmental reporting requirements for the fossil fuel industry is possibly one of the biggest ones. so that is on that. And third one is we know that we miss some subnational and state-owned enterprise data, which mostly goes to fossil energy. So we're also compiling that. So this 54% in reality might actually be even higher than 54. And this is how the G20 looks like. Since this sort of webinar was specifically on G20, and look again at that fossil unconditional category, right? So we're looking at 200 billion within the G20, which has been allocated to fossil energy sectors, meaning sectors either consuming or producing fossil energy. And we see that 200 billion of that has gone without any environmental condition attached. And that, of course, is very worrying, right? Those two are very important. And this is much more than what we have seen in 2008. So this is, that is great news. But this one is really seriously problematic. And within the energy sector, I think we can refer to two things. Number one is that while we all know that a reduction of coal-fired power plants is of the essence, especially India and China both have big new coal policies. Are they big in terms of quantitative amount? No, but the externalities are, of course, quite gigantic. And even United States, Ukraine, some other countries have also implemented new coal policies. So that's problematic. And then the other thing that we're seeing is a lot of oil and gas support just across the G20, right? And the third and last point in my 5 minutes is we do not yet see a green recovery, but at least climate is not entirely absent. And I think that is also very important to highlight. Here on the graph, you see sort of a comparison of the G20 countries. You see a lot of dark gray figures, right? Here, China seems like it's doing very well, but we know that the dark gray bar is actually much, much bigger. This is, again, subnational state-owned enterprises. But generally, you see a lot of dark gray, but you also see quite a bit of green and light green. Light green meaning these policies have clean credentials, but they would need additional safeguards to make sure that this is sort of, the clean energy potential is met. So we see quite a bit of that as well. And that should not be underestimated because those are very positive signs. And 4 areas where we definitely see those popping up is energy efficiency, which is not unimportant. It is one of the sort of the big differences that the International Energy Agency has highlighted as well. An area where we saw investment stagnating in the years pre-COVID. So the fact that there has been more investment in energy efficiency is very important. Second one is definitely the transport sector. So while, yes, we see a lot of sort of bailouts, which might be questionable, we also see a lot of investment in electrification of transport, public transport, non-motorized transport. So that those are, very good things to see as well. And then the fourth one and last one is, of course, renewable energy. And there we also see a lot of countries investing in renewable energy, whether it's conventional renewable energy such as solar and wind, or renewable hydrogen. So we see more and more investment and funding pledges picking up in that. And I will stop right here and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you everyone who has just joined a bit earlier. Welcome to this webinar. Also, thank you for your questions. I see that the Q&A box is already being used, so please use it for your future questions. And also, when you type your question, please specify who you would like to comment on it. With that, I'm going to pass over to Anna Geddes from ISD, and maybe Anna, you can also talk a little bit more based on the research you will present on what made it possible for some countries to achieve a bit more progress on reducing support to fossil fuels.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. So I'll just talk a bit briefly. This bit of work that we did was more backward looking, looking at G20 government support for fossil fuels in the last 3 years, so from 2017 to 2019. And we basically wanted to look at different G20 countries progressed in ending their support for fossil fuels over the period. We ranked these countries in a scorecard as well, where we looked at their transparency, their commitments, the scale of support to coal production, oil and gas production, fossil fuel-based power, and also fossil fuel consumption or use. We also did a smaller investigation where we looked at G20 countries' public money commitments in response to the COVID-19 crisis. So we used some of the data that Tom just presented. First of all, some overall numbers. If you can see here, from 2017 to 2018, the G20 provided over $500 billion for fossil fuels. They did this each year on average over 2017 to 2019. And in terms of where that money went, we saw the biggest chunk going to oil and gas production. You can see on the left-hand side on the slide that I'm sharing, followed by fossil fuel use or consumption. Another way to look at these big numbers is to say what sort of support mechanism did governments use? And the largest support mechanism they used was state-owned enterprise investment, where basically state-owned enterprises like South Africa's electricity utility, ESCOM, or Saudi Arabia's Saudi Aramco, provided capital expenditure in all sorts of different fossil fuel projects. We also saw the second biggest chunk went to price support. So price support is when you regulate your, say, electricity prices at below market prices for consumers. So this $584 billion was actually a drop from the previous 3 years. We saw a 9% drop across the board with the G20. So we did see some progress in terms of reducing support for fossil fuels. Unfortunately, it wasn't not all G20 countries reduced their support. We actually saw 7 G20 countries increase their support over the period. So in terms of how we ranked these countries, we ended up doing 2 different scorecards for OECD and non-OECD countries in the G20, just so we were comparing economies that were at a similar level of development. So for the OECD countries, Germany did best, and Turkey, Mexico, and the UK did worse. Did the worst out of all the the OECD countries. In general, no country did really, really well. The highest score was Germany with 71 out of 100. And Brazil, that got a B, was a sort of similar numerical score. Germany did quite well because it has really good transparency. Its commitments are fairly strong. And in terms of how relative to other countries, it also had relatively lower financial support for oil and gas production and fossil fuel use. Whereas, for example, the UK have relatively high levels of support for fossil fuel use and have quite bad transparency. Brazil also did quite well compared to other countries in the non-OECD because they've managed to reduce some of their state-owned enterprise investment over the period. And Saudi Arabia, probably not surprisingly, did pretty badly compared to other countries, coming last. That's because they have really large capital expenditure from their state-owned enterprises. So they invest a lot in oil and gas production, but they also have a lot of control of prices on fossil fuel use. Having said that, Saudi actually managed to reduce some of their consumer subsidies over the last few years. So there are countries that are making small amounts of progress in different areas. But I think what's really interesting is state-owned enterprise investment is huge. And if we want an energy transition, we're going to need to do something about, or countries are going to need to do something about their state-owned enterprises. That's it from me, short and sweet. So let's move on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anna. I'm going to now go to the discussion of what are inspiring examples of specific policies from different places. And I don't know if you have seen, we already have some questions in the chat box. So the first question is actually, or comment, is stressing the difference between, let's say, Scandinavia and developing countries. So I'm handing over to Kanika Chavla. And I wonder, Kanika, if you agree or disagree with this comment, and what do you see as inspiring examples of green recovery and clean energy transition from the region where you're working?
Great, thank you, Veta. Thank you very much for having me on this panel, and a lot of interesting kind of findings that both Tom and I've shared. So I think there's a lot for me to build on. But broadly to say that there is a lot of difference between developing and developed economies, of course, is a truism, and that is unlikely to surprise anyone. The clean energy markets and renewable, or the renewable energy markets in emerging economies are actually doing really interestingly quite well. And actually what I feel like in terms of the green recovery, what we're seeing is a lot of the emerging economies have continued their support to existing sectors. Now there's an upside to this and a downside to this. The upside, of course, is that the renewable energy markets, whether it is in, which are large renewable energy markets in countries like India, are continuing to do really well. But also because of the declining demand, a lot of countries are kind of limiting the focus that they have on adding new coal. And so sort of Vietnam is a really good example of this, but also, with the focus that Nigeria has on adding a lot more renewable energy capacity as a part of their recovery, what we're seeing coming out of sort of Morocco and Colombia, et cetera. So I think that there are examples of where renewable energy are doing well. But broadly, I would still say that emerging economies have not necessarily at any significant scale done enough in terms of policy action to kind of think about green and recovery together. They haven't really necessarily married those two things. So there are examples of where, a little bit of support has been extended, but a lot more can be done. And so I would actually say that the opportunity, of course, is not lost. It's not yet passed. And I think where we're still seeing a lot of these support mechanisms and additional amounts of public spending is going to happen in the coming months. So I think that there is really an opportunity for emerging economies to think about it in three strategic ways. And those are the recommendations that I would leave with everyone who's joined us today. One is to kind of follow the economics, right? And this is really what this entire session is about. What is really, that's where the zombie energy kind of aspect comes in. But for most of the emerging economies, the focus for the energy transition was on an all of the above approach, where it is that, yes, we have coal, but we'll also build some gas, and we'll of course have a lot more renewables. And the transition was happening in the new additions, where the new additions were disproportionately clean. And that's how the decarbonization was being driven. But now when there is reduced demand, and therefore there will be reduced capacity addition, you need to follow the economics in the sense that you need to not bail out sectors that are circling the drain. And I think that is the number one priority that emerging economies need to think about, is facing the complex political economy of the energy transition rather than continuing with this all of the above approach. The other one, which again, for emerging economies is more complicated than what Matthias was talking about for Sweden and other developed countries, is around what are the competitive priorities on public money. And of course, for all over the world, there is this competitive priority between, now do we spend this money on health, or do we spend it on other development priorities, and energy being one of them. But I think that there is an opportunity to sync efforts. So where clean energy and the energy transition actually aligns with other development priorities, right? And whether this is in the form of efficiency, in sustainable transport, of course, in clean energy, is how do each of these sustainable sectors actually advance other development priorities around healthcare, around education, around nutrition, and agriculture support, things like that. And there is many examples of how this can be done, even though there isn't anything that we're seeing at scale coming out of the emerging economies yet. The last one, I think, is again something we've heard a little bit about sustainable finance, and I think that the difference between the public spending that happened to revive economies after the financial crisis of 2008 and what we're seeing today is the nature of the crisis. What has made this crisis? And in 2008, the crisis was made entirely, of course, by big business, but it was also seen purely as separate from, it was a financial sector crisis that was kind of isolated from all other aspects. Whereas this crisis is a financial and economic crisis that's, of course, triggered by an existential threat. And in this case, of course, a virus, but climate change is a similar existential threat. So what this does is it opens up the door for conversation on existential threats and the impact that they have on financial markets, and on to think about how governments will about existential threats and sort of kind of green finance, not just kind of mobilize more capital for green spending, but really how all capital can have more checks and balances, can be more environmentally conscious, because there's this existential threat that is facing all capital, which will then, have a significant impact on everybody who's putting their money into these financial institutions. So I think that those would be kind of what we're not seeing, but I would say as opportunities. But again, I did want to sort of circle back to the comment that we had, which was that renewable energy markets in emerging economies are doing well. But what is interesting is to see that how the drivers of those markets are quite different from what's happened in the developed world. And that's really where the clues are also for how the developing countries can kind of make good on this idea of green recovery, where jobs, growth, and sustainability can all be balanced together.
Thank you, Kanika, for your intervention, and sorry about the technical issues. So we go back to Elisa.
Hi, Iveta and everyone. Thank you so much for including me on this fantastic panel and really important part of this London Climate Week. So I want to share a little bit just from the perspective of living in Latin America, in Bogota, a little bit of perspective from the region on, I mean, certainly one of the features of this pandemic experience is how it has made some existing challenges and deep structural problems worse and made more visible. So some of the characteristics that have made Latin America and the Caribbean so vulnerable to the pandemic are the same ones that make the region vulnerable to climate change. So informality of labor markets, dependence on fossil fuel production, things also like access to water, electricity, sanitation, land, food security, health services, also financial services, and of course, severe inequalities. So COVID, like climate change, disproportionately affects the most vulnerable people in the region and is worsening these stark inequalities. The World Bank estimates there could be 17 million climate refugees in Latin America by 2050, just from areas where livelihoods are compromised by climate change. So I think this is important context too when we're talking about what the recovery opportunities are. So these combined, the impacts, so economic, social, from these combined crises of COVID and price crashes are dramatic. And a sustainable recovery, no doubt, as has already been said here, needs to focus on policies that address the climate change crisis head on, but also promote equity and resilience in the face of these existing challenges. And also, this means transitions for fossil fuel producers and exporters also in terms of the energy and power supply domestically. So I want to talk a little bit about the optimistic examples, but of course, the reality, what are we actually seeing in the region? There's still pretty limited commitments to green recovery and contradictions within countries as well. So there are some efforts towards renewable energy, some important commitments. For example, Chile announced 30% of additional resources for public investment under its COVID-19 recovery plan called Paso a Paso, Chile se recupera, is there to be used for sustainable and green projects. So this is includes energy efficiency, clean transport, things that we want to see. On the other hand, many countries are continuing to make significant supports, as showed in the aggregate measures early on by Tom and Anna. These supports for fossil fuel production and fossil-based electricity production, for example, in Argentina and Mexico. So on the more promising side, there's also some interesting examples at the subnational level in the context of the pandemic, from cycle paths being expanded from Bogota, where I live, to Mexico City, to New York City, to Paris. These are exciting examples that are being pushed forward in the context of the pandemic. There's efforts such as new emissions taxes at the subnational state level in Mexico, Jalisco, Baja California, Tamaulipas. Colombia announced a clean growth commitment to the future of Colombia, calling for tree planting and also accelerating new renewables, estimating they'll create some 55,000 new jobs. But at the same time, there have been also, on the positive side, some new issuances of green bonds in Brazil, Colombia, so-called sustainable development bonds in Mexico, but will remain to be seen how these are developed and invested. But as I said, this sometimes contradicts with other policies. In Colombia, the government continues to push fracking. There are ongoing plans currently to build new coal-based power plants. In this context, as international investors are increasingly abandoning coal, Colombia is a major coal exporter. There needs to be a more significant political commitment, and clarity about the coal sector, which is extremely vulnerable. And this, while talking about green jobs, which is important, there needs to be more explicit conversation about how to manage coal decline and support the directly affected regions, coal-producing regions. So another in Mexico at the national level is propping up national oil production, refurbishing and building new oil refineries. Argentina set a base price, a fixed barrel price for oil, supporting gas production, and on and on. So there are definitely is more work to be done, though there's indications in both directions. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Elisa. So I think we're not done yet with trying to find positive examples. So I'd like to open the floor to other panelists. Hold on public finance, because we're going to have a separate question just about public finance. But generally, so I'm wondering whether Matthias or Tom or others can comment on some measures looking at fossil fuels, such as carbon tax or green strings when there is conditionality for fossil fuel projects, and how they can be reconciled with recovery. So I don't know, Matthias, if you can comment from the Swedish perspective, which kind of particular policies you can think of, and in Sweden or in other countries, for example, carbon tax.
I'm sorry, my dog is barking in the background, so hope you bear with that. But on your question, I mean, as I highlighted in my introduction, we think that this could be a good time to be introducing carbon pricing measures, and it's been encouraging to see also that like the IMF have also been highlighting that opportunity to introduce these kind of measures. And of course, they can be introduced in sort of various types of ways and at various levels. I think we have, at the moment at least, the highest carbon tax globally, but of course we're welcoming competition in that area to see other countries coming forward with those kind of measures as well. And I mean, there has been a lot of discussion also about, as you say, sort of these green strings or conditionalities attached to the measures being introduced, and that can be also, we've seen that being done differently in different countries. We've had a couple of those examples in Sweden, where, for example, support to the or sort of semi-national airline SAS have been done with certain conditions on sustainability tied to that. And I think we've seen other examples both in France and in Canada as well, where those kind of sort of conditionalities have been introduced. And I think that's something for every country to explore, whether that would be a useful tool for them to use.
Thank you for your comments, Matthias. So Tom, do you want to add anything from the tracker database on green strings or on any other inspiring examples? Or rather, whether green strings are inspiring examples yet?
Sure. So some are definitely, I think, interesting examples. I mean, Matthias mentioned France in their Air France airline bailout, as well as in their bailout of Renault, the car company, included very interesting type of environmental conditionalities. Germany did a similar thing for certain utilities operating coal power plants. The Netherlands, same sort of also environmental conditionalities for KLM, right? So for their airline, for loan and loan guarantees going to KLM. So we definitely see interesting things coming up. Of course, one of the questions is you can put in environmental conditionalities and then you can enforce them later on, right? So even when we see countries implementing policies with environmental conditions, that's very good. But ideally, we also see a somewhat more specific plan in how they are going to make sure that those environmental conditions are enforced, because some of those environmental targets will be in 5, 10, 15 years. So this is not immediately right now. So it would be good to see a very specific plan.
Thank you, Tom. There are more comments now, both in the Q&A and in the chat box. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A box, but we will try to address any inputs. So I'm wondering also, Anna or Lauri, if you have anything to add to the discussion thus far on positive examples or examples quoted.
Sure. I just wanted to back up what Kanika and Elisa said, especially Kanika on India. So in our G20 scorecard, we only looked at how governments supported fossil fuels. If we had done a scorecard that also looked at how governments had been supporting their renewables industry, you would actually find that some of those developing countries slipped up in the ranking. And I think India by far would have been one of those countries. And as Kanika said, although it may not be that they've supported renewables to the scale that is necessary, the things that we have seen happen in India have been incredibly effective in many ways. And there is a very healthy private financing industry for renewables there that some developed countries still haven't achieved. And there are all sorts of really great examples that India can give to the world. And when we work in other countries like South Africa, we're always looking to India for good examples. So I just want to make it clear that in the G20 scorecard, we didn't look at everything that the countries are doing in terms of energy transition.
Okay, thank you. I think we have several participants from India actually, and they disagree with you in the comments. But we'll come back to this later. So, and I'll give Kanika an opportunity to respond as well. But first go to Lauri.
Yes, Iveta, do you want me to come in on the public finance side? I
saw that you had a comment in the chat actually on KLM. So if you have any points for the previous discussion, please share them, and then you can switch to the next question on the role of public finance and green recovery.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, very briefly on the support for KLM in the Netherlands. There were some green conditionalities attached to that support, but those were not necessarily new or additional to the measures that had already been agreed upon by KLM in terms of greening aviation. So yeah, just a word of warning, so to say, that that in some cases those green conditionalities that have been presented were not actually additional to what the sector had already agreed on. Yeah, and I think that's something that we should be aware of. I don't have much else to add on the previous discussion, so I will shift to the topic of public finance. And the way public finance institutions can support a green recovery and a just transition in emerging and developing countries. So first of all, I'd like to say that I'm very excited to be here today and to join this discussion. There is a very important role for public finance institutions to play in ensuring a green recovery, as they represent a massive pool of finance in their own right, but also they leverage huge sums of private finance. So to support a green recovery and a just transition, those public finance institutions should first of all stop doing harm. So the G20 scorecard that was released last week, but also a report we did at OCI together with Friends of the Earth US, shows that there is still a lot of public finance for fossil fuels. And our Still Digging report shows that public finance institutions still provide 3 times as much finance for fossil fuels as for clean energy every year. And that support hasn't dropped since the Paris Agreement was adopted. Just to clarify, that report looks at finance provided by the multilateral development banks, the development finance institutions, the bilateral ones, and also export credit agencies. Fortunately, there is a silver lining. Coal is currently finally on its way out, with Japan and South Korea recently signaling a shift away from coal finance, leaving China as the last big coal financier standing. And that also means that it's now of utmost importance to finish the job on coal, but also begin to focus more on getting public finance institutions out of oil and gas, because the largest share of public finance for fossil fuels, namely 80%, goes to oil and gas and not coal. And this is essential, as oil and gas reserves that are currently in production by themselves already breach the carbon budget for keeping global warming limited to 1.5 degrees. And also because oil and gas, especially in the current context of low oil prices, but also even before that, actually don't deliver on the development promise that they are often supported for. So whilst many public finance institutions argue that government-backed oil and gas finance is necessary to spur development, the data shows that the largest recipients of that support are actually not the poorest countries, and where that finance does flow to lower income countries, it typically benefits the multinational corporations and wealthy donor countries over local populations, often whilst also causing human and indigenous rights violations and displacements, and degrading health and the environment, and increasing the debt burden of recipient countries. So last week, there was a very big global development bank summit, the Financing Commons Summit. This was the first time that that summit took place. It brought together over 450 public finance development institutions that together control 2 trillion in public money every year. And at that summit, CSOs from human rights and development, gender and climate constituencies really spoke with one voice and very clearly communicated that that summit needed to deliver on ending fossil fuel finance and also on debt justice and human rights and community-led development. Unsurprisingly, due to the large variety of banks participating in that summit, the summit didn't deliver clear commitments on ending fossil fuel finance or ensuring debt justice, but the summit's declaration did speak of the need to consider ways and means to reduce fossil investments, even if there were no concrete or time-bound commitments for doing so. Fortunately, I can also highlight that there is a way forward. The European Investment Bank last year adopted a new energy lending policy that ends its oil and gas financing. And at the summit, the EIB very clearly communicated that it makes no economic sense at this stage to continue propping up fossil fuels with public finance. And it also indicated that it is ready to cooperate with other banks to end public finance for fossil fuels. And one clear candidate for such a collaboration is also the Swedish Development Finance Institution, which already ended fossil fuel finance, including for oil and gas, back in 2017. So there are now an increasing number of public finance institutions that are taking steps to limit oil and gas finance in addition to coal finance. And that means that it's now also important to make sure that those examples or those policies set the right example for other institutions to follow. And this is why we think it's really crucial that these institutions that are showing leadership in this area come together and set the right science-based standards and engage also in strategic diplomacy to ensure that other public finance institutions follow suit with similar commitments. There's, of course, also, and that's the main topic, of course, of this part of this webinar, there's, of course, also a huge role for public development banks to play in supporting just transition measures. And I think it's notable that the work that was done on the G20 scorecard report, that in that work, actually few just transition measures were identified by the researchers looking at support provided in the different G20 countries. But there are actually many ways in which public finance institutions can provide, can support a just transition. So they can provide transitional support for impacted workers and community members. They can support economic diversification in fossil fuel producing countries or countries that are highly dependent on high carbon sectors. And they can also deploy their advisory services in support of a just transition. They can help countries assess stranded assets risks and also model alternate industrial policy pathways. And of course, I already mentioned this opportunity to create a leadership coalition of public banks that take their money out of fossil fuels and instead deploy their resources to support a just transition. And there is, of course, also a clear opportunity for banks to join that coalition and also engage in strategic diplomacy to ensure that other institutions follow suit. And I think one other area where public finance should pay attention is their own governance structures. So to really ensure that they play this transformational role and help support green recovery and building back better, they will also need to look at their own governance structures and see if relevant perspectives are represented on their boards and in their decision-making processes. And this also means making sure that CSOs are represented in these decision-making processes, that there is free and prior informed consent and transparency as well. And I'll leave it there for now because I've probably already been talking for too long.
Well, thank you. There is a lot of interest in public finance, or including people asking in the chat if they have a renewable energy project where they should go to. So I'd like to hand over to Kanika, because Kanika, I think there are a lot of questions to you with respect to India on inconsistency. But also just looking at the linkages between private and public finance and just transition. So any kind of additional thoughts that you may share, please go ahead.
Thank you. I think that on the questions that have come up in the chat around policy consistency and regulation and things like that, and the role of electricity utilities, all really relevant points. And, as a person who has worked in this sector for quite some time now, these are, things that I work on every single day. But I also want to just to kind of zoom out a little bit and to just give perspective, is that if you're going to compare policy and regulation for fossil fuels versus renewable energy, I think it's important to keep in mind that while renewables in India, but also in other emerging markets, or for that matter, anywhere in the world, while they're sizable, they're still relatively young markets. And so there is a lot of innovation happening in policy design, in regulation, in figuring out the complex kind of push and pull levers and where the balance will come to sit. And there's so many aspects to it, like how the geopolitics is evolving and how the political economy is evolving and what is just, how demand changes and how much, say, end consumers are willing to pay for certain things. As all of those things change, the design of the energy markets is constantly evolving. So a lot of what we see as policy flip-flop is really quite necessary evolution to kind of adapt to the changing contours of the overall market. That does not mean that we don't have a policy uncertainty problem. We do. And that policy uncertainty problem arises also because of so many competing priorities, as well as kind of the impact of deep-seated fossil fuel interests. And, I think that there's everyone on this discussion today or on this debate today can talk about the fight against in the vested interests of fossil fuel lobbies. And I think that it would be quite ignorant of us to kind of think that that doesn't exist. And even in countries where we are following and all of the above approach, there is still, new coal is losing out to renewables already in India, right? A lot of old coal is becoming unviable because it's running at lower and lower capacity utilization factors. So there is, of course, a lot of pressure to kind of reduce the support that renewable energy gets, or to kind of, electricity utilities, which are in very poor financial health, also are kind of struggling with this one-part tariff versus the conventional two-part tariff that they already are locked into for fossil fuels. So a lot of this is we're in a period of flux, but we're also in a transition, and no transition has ever been clean or clear and without any kind of, up and down. And I think that it is only to be expected that, especially in a young sector like renewables, that this is a period of adjustment. Of course, the top line policy commitment remains strong, as Anna said as well. And I think that we should take heart in that. And then it is the role of institutions like CEW, where I work, to kind of provide the support and course correction that is needed kind of at these intermediary steps. So, but of course, broadly, the point that you made is a relevant one. On public finance and the role of public finance, right? And I think that for far too long, emerging economies or developing countries have kind of, and Matthias, I'm sure you know this well in your FCCC role, that there's been a lot of the commitments have been contingent on if you give me money and technology. But for any transition and for the market to evolve at scale, there just isn't enough public money, whether domestic or international, anywhere in the world. And so the role of public money really should be to crowd in private money. And this is, people have been saying this for years. So there's really nothing new in this. But I think that we still have not internalized what some of this public money can do. And we keep thinking that it needs to go to underserved markets. But when public money is used for project financing, it's a colossal waste of public money. And so public money needs to be able to be market making. And the way that I kind of think of that is if it can address kind of what are your choke points, right? So private money doesn't flow into new markets like renewables or electric mobility or battery storage or whatever else, because there's a lack of familiarity. So there are perceived risks, and there are some real risks, and these can be kind of macroeconomic, like currency risk, and that your electricity utilities are broke, and there's just general macroeconomic instability. But they can also be very specific to the technology type, like there is not enough charging infrastructure, or there's not enough quality controls on your renewable energy deployment, whatever else. If you can identify the specific risks that are acting as an impediment to the flow of private capital and underwrite those risks. Because underwriting is never the end solution, but it's often a very good short to medium term solution. Because a lot of the times the systemic solutions like integration of renewables requires kind of technology upgrades that have gestation periods that are far longer than the period required to add new renewable energy capacity. And in order to not slow down the pace or something like that, you need these interim measures of de-risking. And I think that when you use public money to kind of finance de-risking guarantor pools of capital, you are able to create a lot of leverage to bring in private capital, and you're also able to kind of provide a pipeline of de-risk projects. So there can be a lot of large transactions, which is one of the big challenges for emerging economies, where the ticket size of projects is often so small that large investors don't want to invest. It's not worth their time. So those are, I think, on the new technology where there's a learning curve of capital that we often forget. We often focus only on the learning curve of technology. And I think that that's one area where public money can go in. The other one is on developing comprehensive green industrial policies. A lot of the concern around the transition is that there is an entire value chain that supports existing vested interests of fossil fuels, right? So it's not really necessarily just the thermal power plant, but a lot of micro and small scale enterprises that support both, as kind of upstream and downstream support for existing energy producing or production units. Can we develop, can public money go into supporting green industrial, either, manufacturing hubs, or even just developing an integrated approach so that a maximum amount of the value that is going to emerge from these new sectors can be captured locally. So can you actually manufacture electric vehicles in India? Can you actually manufacture solar panels in Indonesia? Can you, instead of just moving from, an import dependency on the Middle East for oil and gas, can you, to moving that to kind of China and other related countries, you're not necessarily addressing the energy security lever, which is an important one for developing countries. And I think that developing local value capture centers in a way through industrial policy is another interesting way that public money can be used. And finally, I think that, this the just transition topic cannot, by developing countries, be pushed further down the road, as I had mentioned earlier as well. And so there needs to be, the role of public money can also be in kind of doing an accelerated decommissioning market-based buyouts of existing PPAs, of existing coal purchase obligations. And this is going to be central in how these countries kind of deal with the justness, so to speak, of the transition, because so much, as we were hearing before, so much of the economic value in these countries actually does come from hydrocarbon-based industries. So a lot of public money will need to be mobilized to kind of reskill, to redirect value chains to cleaner sectors, but also just to buy out existing contracts.
Thank you very much, Kanika. Thank you. I think it's important points also. You started already linking local content and just transition. So I wanted to come back a little bit to why we have Matthias from the Swedish government on the call, because we really wanted to show an example where there are different things linked together. And Sweden passed the climate law in 2017, and that's when Sweden stopped funding fossil fuels abroad, stopped public finance for fossil fuels. So that's one connection. And the other aspect is that I guess it helps with consistency that was flagged as an issue for other countries. So I wonder, Matthias, if you would like to talk a little bit more about public finance and also Swedish experience.
Yes, sure, thanks. Happy to, and I think many of the points that Kanika raised, I would agree to as well. But coming back to your question, I think sort of this giving or setting the regulatory framework in a long-term perspective would also, provides financial actors and the society at large with the kind of signals they would need to be, for their long-term operations. So with us having set 2045 as a target for climate neutrality, that also helps companies and societal actors to sort of plan their activities and see this is the kind of direction that we're going. And then, based on that long-term target, we then set out a number of sort of stops along the road for us as a society to be arriving at that long-term target. So, for example, we within the framework of the climate policy framework you mentioned, the government needs to present the climate policy action plan to Parliament in the beginning of every governmental term. So that was presented to Parliament now in December last year. It sets out some 130 actions which the government will take during this 4-year period, and all of these then contribute to the long-term goal of climate neutrality and sort of sets the regulatory framework in place, which hopefully then sort of facilitates the transition also for other actors in society, including companies. And I think sort of, the regulatory framework being one aspect, and then another aspect which I'd like to highlight as well, especially when it comes to this sort of balance between public and private financing, just sort of getting the basics right in your own budget process. When we, for example, within the Swedish government budget process, when we come forward with new budget proposals, we have to sort of go through a checklist to see how those proposals relate to gender, how they relate to jobs and growth, and how they relate to climate and the environment. And so that for every budget proposal that comes in, you need to sort of have an analysis of how they relate to those 3 different spheres. So that you make an informed decision when on your budget, on your state budget, sort of in relation to those areas. And then, of course, helps also sort of when allocating public funds, and also then seeing sort of where do you need the private finance to come in. And of course, every country needs, we all need to find our own ways of doing this. But I would believe having some kind of system for that in your national budget process will then also help you to have a dialogue with your private sector to see, okay, where do we need additional investments for sectors which the government will not be. So sort of, the budget, having your budget framework in place, having your regulatory framework in place, and also the kind of regulatory frameworks we're seeing within the EU, the EU taxonomy being developed right now, coming into force next year, as a tool for investors to guide them in the kind of investment decisions they're taking, sort of what is green, what is not green. We saw an example right now coming out from the UK last week, I think, on sort of making it mandatory for companies to use the TCFD reporting, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So I think there's a lot of positive things going on, and for us to make best use of those in sort of building these kind of alliances and supporting each other as governments and as countries in highlighting those kind of opportunities and the positive good examples, we will sort of be coming closer to the goal of sort of phasing out all these kind of various types of fossil activities going on right now, including for the MDBs, for example, making sure that the MDBs are also refraining from financing fossil fuels. And I think that means one thing working together with the MDBs to make sure that they're not supporting that kind of finance. But of course, countries also have to be requesting green financing from the MDBs. So the more the countries can be requesting green finance and climate finance from the MDBs, the less demand there will be, and hopefully that would also help us moving in that direction. Thanks.
Thank you, Matis. I think you also answered, there was a comment in the chat from Widamar, who was talking about a project in Yemen to convert waste into energy. And so what you said is that people should actually demand funding for such projects more and more. And yeah, so MDBs are numerous. African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, European Investment and Bank, and European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. But there are also, I think, like smaller bilateral efforts, bilateral banks established. So I will now hand over to Elisa to talk about maybe development assistance and also just transition. So how this can be linked together. And we've heard from Kanika the point about local content being important and local jobs being so important. So Elisa, what do you think?
Sure. I wanted to, before I jump into that, I wanted to just briefly touch on something people were talking about earlier on the issue of green strings. And I think there were some interesting examples from Europe, and I just wanted to highlight, I don't think we have very any examples on the positive side to refer to in the Latin America region. On the contrary, I think this is important to highlight. Actually, in the pandemic, we've seen pushes towards the opposite, that there's been requests to reduce environmental and social regulations around mining and extraction activities under the excuse of needing to activate these energy and other extractive sectors as part of the economic recovery. So I think it's Natural Resource Governance Institute calls it a new race to the bottom. And I think it's really important to pay attention to that in the context of recovery. And this comes back to some of the discussions earlier in terms of incumbent interests and that are a challenge. But in terms of and also there was another piece I wanted to add there on the idea of the green strings is, I think, also important to highlight in the context of pushing new renewable projects, that these also continue to have important social and environmental protections and consultations, and that these not be pushed forward at the costs of consultations with local communities, et cetera, as there have been, unfortunately, some concerns in early efforts, for example, in Colombia on the northern coast, or similarly around large-scale hydro. These are not innocuous options, so it's important to keep these in mind, along with the other issues like Kanika mentioned about local industrial development, which I think are really important. So on that note, to talk a little bit about the in the public finance and just transitions direction, I wanted to highlight in particular some ideas thinking about how this just transitions are going to occur, in particularly with attention to developing countries. Countries face different contexts, not just developing, but across the world, different contexts and challenges to transition. Some work by colleagues at SEI have shown how the differing levels of dependency in combination with the dependency on fossil fuels production or fossil fuel-based energy and their financial, in combination with their financial and institutional capacities to support transitions, there's a variety of situations for different countries. And this really means that we can't make the transition happen at the global level without international support for countries with less capacity to transition away from fossil fuels. And this has to be part of the discussion. In addition to public finance institutions ending their support for fossil fuels, countries with limited financial and institutional capacity, high dependency, and this dependency can be around the rents that are used for public budgets for supporting things like education and health, and for foreign currency to pay debts for the jobs that are created. In the case of Colombia, the fund for addressing the emergency, the immediate emergency of the pandemic was drawn on royalties that had been saved from largely from oil and coal and gas extraction. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind. Again, in the Latin America region, many fossil fuel producing countries have been particularly hit hard in this context. So it's urgent to provide support to those in need in these dire times, and that can include in fossil fuel producing industries, but it has to be really clear that this is not a long-term commitment. It has to be really clear what this is for, and it's about a transition. So it's also a really important moment with these low prices. It highlights the vulnerability of this dependency, and it's a really great moment and opportunity to talk about diversification, to talk about reducing these vulnerabilities and take action around the energy transition, and highlighting importance of benefits of decarbonization, whether it's reducing air pollution and improving health outcomes. The IDB estimates 15 million new jobs will be created by a transition to a zero emissions economy in Latin America and the Caribbean by 2030. The World Resource Institute reports that it could add a transition could add $535 billion to Brazil's GDP by 2030, compared with business as usual. There's some estimation of $240 billion in annual fuel subsidies in the region, which, if redirected, could open up a tremendous space for investments in clean energy and clean transport. But coming back to what is this just transition, I think Kanika mentioned some pieces, but I think it's important to put it together. This means supporting workers and communities that are affected by decarbonization. It means job security support for which means job training. It means education. It means social protection. It means attention to gender and other axes of distributional effects that are where these transitions tend have uneven distributional effects. It means addressing the environmental and social costs of fossil fuel production and the closure of mines, cleaning up and closing mines responsibly, how these costs are unevenly distributed. And most importantly, this has to be done through an inclusive and democratic process that involves all stakeholders, not just the firms, not just the government, but communities and workers. So I think in this context, this is a just transition, and that's the origins of the just transition idea. It's not just about greening the energy system. It's about providing decent jobs. It's about coming up with new industries, new alternatives. It's about social inclusion. It's about human rights, and it's about reducing poverty and addressing using this opportunity to address the structural challenges that exist in places like fossil fuel producing countries like I live in, Colombia. So I think another, I wanted to highlight the economic diversification in particular, where investment in education and innovation is really key to improve the resilience of the economy. And I think countries know that. I think all these countries know that, and it's a challenge of how to get there. But it's partly about building human capital and strengthening institutions that can contribute to these goals, and paying attention to what existing local contexts and strengths there are. And I want to mention one last point in particular is the issue of transparency. And I think this is important in the just transition before we got to the pandemic, but I think in the pandemic it becomes even more important, with its transparency around these dollars that are being spent, but it's transparency in the context where people are locked up in their houses and there can't be proper oversight, and there's all sorts of new challenges around how citizen monitoring happens and how social control occurs. So I think Daniel Kaufman from the Natural Resource Governance Institute calls for radical transparency, this idea that this comes out of his work on natural resource governance and monitoring revenue, expenditures, and collection, but this idea that it's not just about making the data available, which is really key, but also having access and having communities be able to have the capacities to intervene and engage with that data. So I think in terms of, there are some examples with how to support just transitions. We have the EU's Just Transition Mechanism, which is a really interesting initiative and needs to be followed closely. And I think can give us some ideas for how to think about that on a global scale. And before I stop, I just wanted to mention a couple other interesting ideas that I've come across that are coming out of civil society proposals in the region. There's a movement, civil society group called Nuestra América Verde, Our Green America, that also brings up some other ideas around finance opportunities, is around to develop a coalition, a global South coalition against tax havens, highlighting that Latin American countries lose around $13.5 billion a year because of tax havens.
Elisa, I'm really sorry, but I think we are running out of time.
Okay, so well, you can look those up yourself, but I think there's some important other ways to think about finance. I think the international mechanisms are key, and these need to be thought about in the ways that I mentioned, but there are others in terms of how to reorganize where countries spend their budgets.
Okay, thank you very much. And I saw there was a lot of interest in the audience to what you were saying and people agreeing with you. So we don't have any more time for discussion. So I'm going to close it, but I encourage you to reach out to our panelists bilaterally. I believe you can find their details, so I hope they will be amenable to responding to your queries. I also would like to just highlight that on the clean energy costs, there has been a lot of research showing that it's actually cheaper. You can just look up the latest Lazards, for instance, review of levelized cost of energy. But there is a research by other organizations as well. So we've heard a lot of different examples, both bad and good, about what's going on right now, about the recovery still supporting some of the zombie projects. We heard about vested interests still supporting fossil fuel energy. But we also heard about the importance of just transition as a way to overcome those obstacles. And I think that's the summary for our discussion, that we have mixed signals right now, but that's our role as research organizations and civil society, to have the transparency, to keep the drumbeat on what's going on, where the money is going in the wrong direction. I don't know if this can be called radical transparency, but we are trying with the energy policy tracker, with other research available from our partners. And we encourage you all to provide feedback, also to send us feedback through the energy policy tracker, which you can do. And I thank you very much for joining. I thank all the panelists for this very vivid discussion. The fact that we ran out of time just shows that we should continue. And with that, I'm wrapping up and wishing all of you and the London Climate Action Week a successful continuation. Thank you and goodbye.